Hello and welcome. I'm Carol Massar, anchor for Bloomberg Business Week TV and radio, and of course, host of the Bloomberg Breakaway CEO Summit. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this. It is the first of 3 town halls that we're going to be hosting over the next few months, where we'll look at the new normal for business leaders. We know so much is coming at you. I do want to start by thanking our series sponsor, Atlassian, for their support. They too have been looking closely at the future of work and what it means for executives right now. And you can learn more by clicking on the resources tab on the website. Well, today we're going to be looking at inclusivity, and we're also going to talk about team building. I've got a conversation with General Stan McChrystal that's coming up a little bit later on in our program. And first up, though, we have a really excellent panel, thoughtful panel, that's going to be led by our own Michele. He's the head of D&I Americas for Bloomberg. Now, if you have questions for our speakers or for Chris and I, please put those in the Q&A box just to the right of the video screen. We also encourage you to engage with other attendees in the event chat, so do be sure to check that out. And if for any reason you experience technical difficulties, try to refresh your browser first. If that doesn't work, you can access support in the event chat as well. And definitely check us out on social. Use social media. Just use the hashtag #TheNewNormal, and of course at Bloomberg Live. With that, I'd like to welcome Michele to get us all started. Chris, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Michele. I am Bloomberg's head of diversity and inclusion for our Americas region. And I'm here with an esteemed panel today to talk about inclusivity and inclusivity in your team strategy moving forward. So with us today, we have Deanna Mulligan, who is the chair of the board for GuardianLife Insurance. She's also the author of the book Higher Purpose: How Smart Companies Can Close the Skills Gap. We have Adia Harvey Wingfield, who's a professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis, and Dominic Price, who's a resident work futurist at Atlassian. Now, Dominic, I have to ask you, resident work futurist. Tell me about what that is.
I'll be honest, because we're amongst friends and very intelligent people here. It is the best made-up job ever. I'm surrounded by people with real jobs, and I've got a made-up job. We created it because our mission's all about unleashing the potential in every team. And we're like, you know what? We need to understand the future of teamwork in terms of skills and diversity and inclusion and people, and how do we be more human in work, and what the impact of technology in place. And so for the last 4 years, I've been fascinated in dreaming and exploring the future of work and helping us navigate there every single day.
Excellent, excellent. So that takes us right into our conversation around inclusivity in the future of work. And so one of the things we've talked a great deal about, especially in my part of the world around D&I. Since May, we've had a lot of companies come out with definitive statements of support around diversity and inclusion, generally, and more specifically for Black Lives Matter. Other companies, actually Guardian in particular, have taken action to sign on to the CEO pledge for diversity and inclusion. These public statements are a good step, and they're demonstrative of commitment. But I guess the question is, what should companies actually be doing to live up to those statements? In other words, how do we walk the talk? So, Deanna, let me start with you on that one, and then maybe we'll go around.
Well, thank you, Chris. Guardian was happy to sign on to the CEO inclusion and diversity statement, but actually, we've been practicing inclusion and diversity for many years at Guardian. And a couple of things I'd like to highlight that we have done most recently. One of those is to set up listening sessions with our executive team and diverse team members throughout the organization. So I think the current Zoom, Skype environment makes it much easier to take frontline team members, for example, and bring them into a meeting of the senior executive team and just listen. So listening to people at all levels is one idea. A second thing I think companies need to do is not just ensure people have a seat at the table. Everybody talks about ensuring people have a seat at the table, but they also need to ensure that once they get to the table, they have a voice and they talk. And we need to get people at the table talking and everyone listening, because I think there are lots of good ideas out there that CEOs need to listen to. And then finally, we need to celebrate accomplishments and celebrate wins. It's important that everyone knows when things go well and things go right. And I think that's going to motivate everyone to continue to explore and be innovative and find new ways to make people not only feel included, but to make their inclusion part of the overall success of the company.
Professor, what would you say to that?
Well, I think those are great statements, and they are supported by a lot of the research in this area that talks about ways that companies and organizations can address these issues. I think the only things that I would add to elaborate a bit on what was just said is that research also indicates that when we are focusing on the challenges that may be present for workers of color and Black workers in particular, it's important not to paint with too broad a brush and assume that Black workers' experiences are universalized or necessarily commonly shared. One of the things that I've learned from my own research is that where Black workers are situated in the organizational hierarchy makes a very big difference in terms of the types of racial experiences that they encounter in workplaces. So I think it's really useful for organizations to be attuned to how, even among their Black workers, those experiences may vary depending on where those workers are employed and in what kinds of jobs those workers are employed. So I would emphasize the importance of focusing on that. I would also just emphasize the importance of making sure that managers are brought in, particularly mid-level managers, to creating solutions to these types of issues. Other research has indicated that often managers can be left out of these types of strategies, and that when they are too top down, it doesn't necessarily address the types of solutions that are useful at middle levels for acknowledging the challenges that workers are facing across the board. And it's important to make sure, again, that even if we're focusing on mid-level managers, we're not excluding workers who are in various tiers of the organization itself.
Yeah. It's a great point that you bring up, just to stay there for a second. You know, one of the things when we talk a lot about inclusion efforts, they often tend to stall at the middle management level. And so in your work, how have you thought about engaging middle managers in this conversation when, you know, middle managers are thinking, you know, I've got to make widgets, basically. I'm not concerned about necessarily who's making it. I just got to get them made. How do you engage middle managers in that conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that it helps for middle managers to be able to see and understand how being more attuned to these broader issues and having more racial diversity in an organization ultimately benefits the organization and those workers at large, right? And I think that when managers are able to see that not having more racial diversity does not really work to your benefit, you don't get the same variety of ideas and viewpoints and perspectives, and the ways that those viewpoints and ideas and perspectives are influenced by racial background and other aspects of people's experiences, mean that organizations may be lacking and frequently are lacking in terms of the different viewpoints and talents and perspectives that they can bring to a table that can help adequately solve pressing and challenging problems. So whether we're talking about people who are creating widgets, as you put it, or people who are in the healthcare industry, or people who are in other fields, it helps, I think, for organizations and for managers to know that this is something that benefits them and the organization at large. But it also is really useful to know that there are ways that they can be part of the solution, rather than simply giving instructions to be more attuned to diversity without clear, specific guidance about what that looks like. When managers are brought into ways that they can readjust hiring, ways that they can think about the culture in the departments or areas where they manage, where they can think about mentoring programs and how those can reach everybody, the data indicate that these are concrete strategies that really are able to move the needle.
And Dom, as you think about the future workplace, you know, have you had to deal with that at all? Those questions of, you know, integrating these statements that everybody has embraced, but you know, how they're going to walk that talk?
Yeah, it's a great point. That I particularly like what you're saying there, Adia, around how do you actually have to do it, right? It's actually very easy to put it on a poster or on a website, but like, how do you follow through? How do you connect with those middle managers and people around? One of the things that we've sort of stated, you know, if you spend $1 on diversity, you need to spend 2 on inclusion, right? Because you don't get one without the other. Like you have to do the follow through. But also, I think we have to acknowledge that you have a choice. And I think a lot of leaders are actually making the choice that we prefer they didn't make in some companies, because if you have a homogenous team, you will go fast. You won't be innovative, as Adia just pointed out. You'll be creative, right? You're not going to inspire your customers. You're not going to have that rich tapestry of customs and backgrounds and experience. But it's a decision that as a leader you get to make. I think leaders should make the right decision and hire from a diverse talent pool and build a place of inclusion where people feel the safety to do the best work of their lives. And we encourage our people to do that. One of the things that we've done a little bit differently, instead of measuring diversity and inclusion at the organizational level, which we still do, we've actually started to measure it at the team level. So instead of saying, oh, like, you know, it feels all right at an aggregate, but actually, you know, if you take gender, for example, you've got sort of all the females in one part of the organization, all the males in the other. That's not diversity, right? And so how do we do it at a team level? And how do we help teams not only assess that, but correct it? And so turning that into action has been something we've been focusing on. I think there's upside in the current future of work we're experiencing. You know, one of there's lots of bad things about COVID and the pandemic, but if you think about work from home and flexibility, it gives us access to a way more diverse talent pool in terms of caregivers, the disabled, a whole lot of people that physically can't get into an office, where if we use these kind of mediums, you can get these people that have amazing hearts and amazing minds and give them access to meaningful work. And the contribution they give is as good, if not better, than anyone else. So I think there's a whole lot of upside if we could tap into flexibility as well.
And you just, sorry, go ahead. Were you going to say something, Deanna?
I was just going to say, I agree with what Dom is saying, and we have seen that remote work promotes flexibility, which helps promote inclusion and diversity. It gives us an opportunity to hire from lots of different locations, which is also important. And then the final thing is our training and our evaluation of managers includes the model that a good manager manages a diverse team and uses that tapestry of experience Don and Adia were speaking of to produce results. So I agree with what Don was saying, that you should be measuring diversity at all levels, and we actually look at it at the leader level or the managerial level.
Yeah. And both of you in your answers just now just mentioned hiring, and so I wanted to zone in on that a little bit. So recently there was a large bank CEO here in the United States that got in some trouble for suggesting that Black talent is almost impossible to find. Those of us who work in D&I know this is not true. Rather, what's true is that hiring managers are often more comfortable going with what they know, you know, some sort of finding their usual suspects. So as a leader, how do you convince your hiring managers, the people below you, to think outside of the box or to look in places with which they aren't familiar for their talent? Why don't we start, Deanna, with you on that one?
Well, we actually started a program a few years ago. I started it with my executive team and HR, and we cascaded it down, where we asked people to put into a database people they know who could refer us to diverse candidates. It's not enough to use the recruiting firms. It's, you know, it's a baseline to say the recruiting firms, we want a diverse candidate pool when you're hiring. But we also went beyond that and said, we want you to contribute the names of your friends, your professional associates who can refer us on to the diverse pool, because sometimes the recruiters don't reach them. And then HR actually used that database, and we found some incredible diverse people who wouldn't have come to our attention otherwise, who are now in our organization and we think are going to make a tremendous contribution. So I personally pushed hard and called on members of my team and said, you have to put names in this database. They may not be people who are available to hire, but they can lead us to people who are available. That's just one example, something we've done.
Yeah. Dom or Adia?
Yeah, I want to point. Yeah. Oh, are we both? Oh, okay.
No, go ahead, Adia.
I just want to make sure that what Deanna is saying is so important, and I think it echoes one of the key things that comes out of the research on this, which is that proactivity is absolutely essential. And one of the areas where the data show that many managers go wrong is either they sit back and wait for candidates to come to them, or they rely on these questions of these networks and these relationships and these existing ties that they already have. And both of these strategies are ones that fail. They fail time after time after time, and they fail consistently, because ultimately what the data show us is that frequently people are networked and in relationships and connected to people who share their background, or with whom they share similar cultural cues, or whom they already know from existing educational experiences or what have them. this is an incredibly useless strategy for building a more racially diverse client pool and a more racially diverse employment pool. Data indicate that organizations have to, one, take intentional steps to make sure that they are not simply going with what's familiar and what's comfortable and with the people who are already like them, but they have to take this step of reaching out to networks, professional organizations, academic universities, institutions of higher learning, places that may be a little bit outside of their beaten path, but this is how they turn up candidates that come from different backgrounds and places that are different from them. I have some personal experience with this in my own department at Washington University. We are one of the most racially diverse departments, I think, in sociology and certainly on our campus, in part because this was one of the strategies that we took, that we made sure that we reached out to people who were coming from different backgrounds and people who were immersed in various professional networks. And the end result of this is that it's yielded a department where about half of the faculty are people of color, and importantly, about half of the full professors, people who have reached the highest rank in the professoriate, are also people of color. And that's not something that you see every day, but it's also not something that happens by accident. This happened because we made an intentional effort to make sure that this was what our department looked like.
Yeah. Dom, any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I just love the use of the word there, intent. Like this happens because you do it on purpose. It doesn't happen well by accident. I mean, you might be lucky, but it doesn't happen well by accident. And I think one of the things that we need to be really conscious of, again, for leaders out there thinking about this, is it's very easy to talk about diversity and inclusion, but you actually have to follow through. People are going to recognize you and reward you for following through. And I think what both speakers have just shared there is role modeling. Right? It's not asking someone else to do something that you wouldn't do yourself. And the minute you role model that behavior, you'll be amazed how many people sort of mimic and copy. One of the things we've added into our interview process is asking people what the diversity is like, where they're coming from. And it's not that they're going to copy, cut, and paste that, but you can learn a lot about someone from their success. And when they tell stories of team success in the environments they've been in, you want to understand, are they the kind of person that's going to invest and say, I'm playing the long game here. I want to get this rich tapestry of talent together, even though I know that we're going to argue and we're going to disagree and it's going to feel harder. That's what collaboration is, right? Collaboration is respectful dissent. It's not consensus. It's not violent agreement. It's quite different. And so when you get those different backgrounds, you want that rich discussion, but we know that takes longer, but we also know it's more valuable. So how do I make sure people are willing to invest in that and play the long game and get a better result for the team and for their customers, rather than play the short game, which is, if I hire a whole lot of people like me, we'll get on really well, it'll be really quick, it's not going to be effective. And so I think one of the measures of success for us has to change from raw productivity, which is what we tend to over-focus on, to actual team effectiveness. What does it mean to belong in a team and have team cohesion, which is an area we've been focusing on internally and with our customers.
And that's a great segue to this next question. You know, we've been in this remote environment now for 7 months, maybe going on 8 months, since mid-March. A lot of organizations have said already that they're committed to remote work at least through the end of the year, if not longer. Collaboration is this word that many organizations use. But the question, I think, is, how do you build that collaboration? How do you collaborate? How do you have camaraderie when people can't physically be together, when we have to work in this two-dimensional environment? How do you build that cohesion? Dom, you started talking about that a little bit, so why don't we stay there with you on that one?
I think the first thing we have to accept is we have to unlearn the habits of the past, because we can't go back. We can't hit rewind. We can't go back before March, and however much we miss the water cooler or the in-person meetings, like, we can't do them right now. So once you get over that, we're then going to go, cool, we're in a constraint-based environment. It's when we're our most innovative, when we're constrained. And so what can we do? Some of the upsides, we did some research recently. We did a survey of 5,000 people across the globe. You look at the upside of some of this environment, this medium. So women spoke highly about how they'd seen the removal of the status game in work, and they felt more liberated in their work. I'm like, cool. That's an awesome upside to this environment. There's so many people are like, oh, the idea of the construct of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday didn't work for me. But now I've got flexibility. I feel like I can contribute more meaningfully to work and my family and society. And so what we can actually do is we can build ways of working now that are agnostic to where you work and really focus on how you connect. One of the things I've been practicing, which is nothing to do with technology, and it's completely free of charge, is closing the big thing on the front of my face and opening the two big things on the side, right? And listening more. Because when I'm in a workshop, I tend to be the tall guy that grabs the pen and gets on the whiteboard, and I don't hear what I don't hear from the people that don't speak. But in this medium, it's a lot easier for me to go, actually, I'm going to pause and listen to other people and actively consume that, like genuinely hear it. So I think this medium can be a huge leveler for us because it's ultimate equality, right? We're all on a very similar internet connection. Doesn't matter where we are in the world or our background, we can all contribute. So I think the more we realize that collaboration is about bringing ideas, but also listening and being wrong, and I think the better we can all become. And then we can also roll that out in a hybrid environment when we have some people back in an office and some people working from home and some people working from a co-working space.
We have done what I might call scheduling spontaneity. So we don't have the water cooler anymore, but you can schedule a 15-minute coffee break with somebody. Zoom coffee, we do all the time. We do after-work parties. We do things that are specifically fun, like having a bake-off or a costume contest. Or at one point, we had a tour my space. So different people at different levels of the organization gave a video tour of their working space, like a welcome to my office. So I absolutely agree with Dom that we can't use this as an excuse. This is what we are, and I believe we can make it work.
Adia?
Yes, I would just add that while certainly it's critically important during this time when we're all, or many of us are working from home and not seeing people as often as possible, I will say that this is one area that does concern me when it comes to these issues related to diversity, largely because a lot of research indicates that for many workers of color, again, particularly Black workers, they often are more likely to feel isolated, marginalized, and disconnected from the environments where they are employed. So I worry that when we are in these spaces where we are less likely to be in an office and less likely to have those spontaneous interactions and less likely to be around other people, there may be ways that that isolation becomes magnified for Black workers and for workers of color. I think this is something that organizations particularly want to be attuned to and want to be cognizant of as they are thinking about how to take their environments, how to take their workplaces forward under the current environment. We know that a lot of research does indicate that having more flexibility and working from home can be very productive for many workers in terms of giving them more opportunities to schedule their workloads and their days in ways that are better suited for them and their particular needs. But I think organizations also want to be mindful of the fact that we don't want to prioritize that scheduling and those opportunities at the expense of workers of color who may frequently be left out of informal or formal opportunities for networking and relationship building.
Yeah. Just to build on that,
I think that brings up good. Yeah.
There's also the social aspect, which is when you see someone around the office, you're like, hey, Deanna, you don't seem yourself right now. Like, is everything okay? You get those social interactions, which you don't get in this context. So I think there is that fear of out of sight, out of mind. And we don't want to create a two-tier system, which I think if we do it by accident, we'll inadvertently create a two-tier system. And I think we want to create one of more inclusivity. So I love that point.
Yeah.
And just building on employee research.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say we have an employee resource group, as many companies do, for people of color, and we have a lot of allies within that group as well, and they have very frequent meetings and social events, and they also visit the executive team. So the executive team invites them once a week to come and talk about the goals that we've set and to report on the progress, because we want to make sure the executive team doesn't lose sight of the goals that we have, but it also gives the people in the employee resource group an opportunity to come before the executive team and then, offline to have social interaction as well.
And this is, I think, a great point, right? There are some very specific adverse impacts on diversity in this remote environment. We have young people who are living alone right now. We have women who are traditionally shouldering the greater burden of childcare, unfortunately. Working parents, two-parent working families. We talked a little bit already about the people of color who miss out on that organic development that already when they're in the physical environment, it's going to be even harder for them in this virtual environment. So how do we meet the needs of all of these constituents and the organization in these remote work environments? Deanna, why don't we start with you on that?
Well, in terms of people who bear the primary responsibility for childcare or elder care or schooling, we actually have enhanced our benefits this year, and we added 2 extra weeks to paid time off that employees can take paid basically for any reason that applies to their situation. We also, of course, give them unpaid time off through the Family Medical Leave Act, and we created a fund where they could apply to be reimbursed for some of that time if they needed to go beyond our generous paid time. We also created Quiet Fridays, where we said we're going to have Fridays where we don't have meetings so that people can clean off their desks, maybe attend to some family needs during the day if they need to, and finish their work at night. We had a floating mental health day this summer and just said, take one day off as a mental health day. So there are things you can do to help relieve that burden. Another thing that we did is we arranged for backup emergency child care and elder care, and we've always had that. But we've seen over the summer that usage of that benefit went up by 25%. So it does matter what corporations do and what benefits they offer.
Yeah, yeah. Adia, any thoughts on that, including all of these constituents?
Yeah, I think that I want to echo a specific point Deanna just made, which is the importance of organizations doing what they can to support workers. I think that's so critical and so necessary. And one of the things that I hope will be one of the bright spots to come out of this pandemic is ideally that many organizations will realize that the changes that they are making now to adapt to these unforeseen but very upsetting circumstances are ones that perhaps should have or could have been made a while ago, or things that they keep in place going forward. I would expect, again, and this is based on what a lot of the research says, but I would anticipate that many workers will find that these types of changes, if organizations are making changes like what Deanna has described, I expect that many workers will find these to be ones that really facilitate and aid in their ability to do their jobs better under these adverse circumstances. But I think that they're also going to think that these are changes that they want to keep in place because these will help to continue to do their jobs and perform their work more successfully once, knock on wood, we're in a better place with this whole situation and we go back to some right we go back to some version of normal. So I really would like to see organizations making shifts to make these kinds of changes more permanent. The only things that I would suggest are that, again, I think it's really important for organizations to think about how having racially diverse employees mean that you want to take into consideration what various constituencies in your organization will be impacting. And I think we also want to think about how the types of policies that are being put in place from organizations might be expanded more broadly, right? So that if I'm not fortunate enough to work at Deanna's company, but I work at a different place, how can we expand these ideas and these benefits so that workers at large are able to take advantage of and benefit these? It should not just be that I have to work where Deanna works to have access to these policies that aid in me doing my work better and aid in me having a more productive life as a worker. I personally think these should be the types of policies that organizations adapt at large because they really do benefit workers at large.
Well, just to put some facts on Adia's assertion there, our turnover in 2020 has been lower than our turnover in 2019. And we hear stories of people, women in particularly, and women of color, having to quit to stay home with their children. And our turnover rates have actually been lower than they were last year.
That's great. Dom, did you want to weigh in on this one? I think I saw you nodding your head vigorously.
Yeah, I agree with everything, so I won't repeat anything there. There's no need for me to mansplain. But I think one thing to add, we're trying to help our frontline leaders with some pragmatism. We rolled out something years ago called the Atlassian Team Playbook. It's all of our free resources of how all of our teams across Atlassian work. We've got a whole lot of diversity and inclusion plays in there as well, and exercises. One that we added recently is called the Work-Life Impact Play, and it works on the basis that everyone is having a unique experience of work from home. And I think the mistake we're making, and I've made this mistake, is I just assume everyone's having the same experience as me, but they're not. Everyone's having a very unique experience. So this play helps you understand what is your work from home situation, what's the nature of your role in terms of how much you can do alone versus how much you need a team for, which is a lot harder when you're remote, and what the quality of your network is, both socially and in the work context. And we have that discussion as a group. And it's been an amazing liberator in having conversations of empathy and vulnerability without saying the word empathy or vulnerability. which I find a lot of leaders go and read about and regurgitate, but they don't actually practice. And so that work-life impact play is given our leaders of all shapes and sizes around the organization a chance to connect meaningfully with their peers and their teams on real things. And so we're turning all that sort of thought into action.
Excellent, excellent. Well, this is a topic we could certainly talk quite a bit more about for a long time. But I did want to thank you for the time you've spent today. Thank this amazing panel, Deanna Mulligan, Dom Price, Professor Adia Wingfield. Thank you so much for your insights today. And we look forward perhaps to talking with you about inclusivity in the near future. Thanks again. And thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
General McChrystal, it is so great to have you here with us. First of all, how are you doing, and what's your world been like the last 6 or 7 months?
Carol, first, please call me Stan, and we're doing great. It's been very different. We suddenly stopped traveling so much, and as you and I talked a little while ago, my 3 granddaughters live next door to me, so I get this amazing amount of time with my family. And so it's been a reflective period of life, which isn't all bad.
No, exactly. Like for a moment, if you can, not think too much about the hardship, right? And certainly the impact of the pandemic, but it really has made us all stop and think about kind of how we've been living our lives and the processes. And I think about that for companies in particular, that I think it's been a moment to kind of reassess how we do things, how we run companies, how employees work, how we lead at our companies. But I do want to ask you, because I think what's been interesting about this time, and we've seen this with our breakaway members here at Bloomberg, is that some companies have actually done very, very well. We know, the headlines about Netflix, and because everybody was streaming. And then there are some companies that have just had a really difficult time because of the pandemic. It's not just one story that's out there. So I do wonder, as leaders, do we kind of throw out all the lessons and all the rules and all the playbooks that we've been following for decades because of the past 6 or 7 months?
I don't think we do, Carol. I think the first thing is soldiers always analogize things to war. When the conditions change dramatically, you adapt to those or you pay. Now, there are certain businesses that almost automatically did well in a pandemic. If you sold disposable, sterile wipes, things like that, you were going to do well, certain kinds of food and things like that. But the reality is the broad breadth of our businesses have got to operate well. And I think that there's a tendency to say we sent much of our workforce home, not all of it, because essential workers couldn't. But then when we got home and we opened our laptops and we were able to connect, there was this big sigh of relief that says, aha, this is not so hard. We can do it. And for a while, we executed. But what I would argue is we were operating on muscle we built up before, on capabilities we'd established through times before when we were interacting and operating differently. And so I think to assume that this was an automatic 180-degree turn and the new normal is going to be dramatically different isn't paying attention to all the signals. It's part of them.
So it sounds like you think a lot of the changes that are happening now, and I think about leaders, because it's interesting, we're hearing from certainly the last week or so, the big bank CEOs about, wanting to get workers back, or some thinking that, this is the way it's going to be. We're going to have a lot of workers working from home. I do wonder, we're getting different messaging out about kind of what the way forward is. And we've also got, we're dealing with leadership where there's mixed messaging or there's outright falsehoods that are put out there. How do you lead in that environment?
I think first admit what you do not know. I think you have to be very honest with your team and say, here's our situation in the marketplace. Here's our situation financially. Here is the strategy as we have adapted it to the current conditions. And then if you're not 100% sure if that strategy is going to be the right one or will have to be adapted more, tell the team, because they will know that intuitively anyway, or they will assume that. And so be very honest with the team that you're going to have to iterate the organization to what works. I would argue most organizations don't know what's going to work even 2 years from now, right now, because there are a number of factors driving it. One, we don't know if you make the decision to get rid of your offices, work entirely from home. We don't know what the dynamics of interpersonal relationships over time will be as you forget the times when you were together around the coffee pot. We don't know about leader development. We don't know how the market will change, how our competitors will adapt. So assuming that there is a new normal, this is it, and we're going to lock it down and move forward to greatness, I think is not paying attention to the fact we are on stormy seas with heavy winds, and it's going to keep pushing us in multiple directions. And what we have to do is be very cognizant of what's happening and continue to adjust.
Stan, I thought what you just said about competitors, like you don't know what your competitors are doing, because I do think Wall Street has watched this very, very closely when they were either bringing traders back versus those who weren't, right? Like a fraction of a second can mean a difference in terms of a profit on Wall Street. So I do wonder, as you said, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but will there be, do you think companies that essentially have more workers back at work in a physical, setting, a physical corporate setting, will have an advantage over those that are letting workers stay at home? Or do we not know that yet? Which will be better?
Yeah, I think there'll be an argument both ways. My personal view is those that bring workers back are going to have an advantage. If we think about what builds trust, trust is built through interaction with people over time, and it's many things. You trust someone that you see a lot, you watch their behaviors, you know their intentions. Mm-hmm. It's harder to build up trust through a virtual medium or someone that you don't deal with very often. And trust cuts down transaction costs, so it makes you better. What do we do in most organizations? We do team building events. Now, having said that, I think that organizations that say, okay, everybody's going to come back the way it was in 1953, and we're going to avoid technology, are making a big mistake too, because I think we're going to have this hybrid where we do certain things much more efficiently, like cutting down travel, a lot of which is pretty inefficient, and doing virtual things. But I think the people that you've got to be bonded with, you're going to have a face-to-face interaction with pretty frequently to make that as powerful as we hope it'll be.
I want to come back to technology because I remember our last conversation last year, and I want to come back to that. But I want to ask you, speaking of teams, I mean, how are you advising your clients right now? Your clients are well-known brands, well-known, companies to our Breakaway members. I'm curious, how are you making sure, or they are making sure that their teams are inclusive, cohesive, and productive in this environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first thing is we don't have much choice right now because it's really impractical to bring teams together. So you adapt to the current environment, which means you have to be more intentional. What I tell people is we need to communicate better than ever before. A lot of our communications was always nonverbal, how you carried yourself, how you reacted to things. And there were also meetings before meetings as you stood in the hallway or around the table before the meeting started, or in the hallway after. That's not happening now. So we've got to be more intentional about communicating our priorities, making sure that the information we put out is clear and as complete as we know. But we also have to be intentional about being inclusive and creating diversity, which means if you're virtual and you want to just get together with the people you know a lot, you call them up and you interact, you've got to be more thoughtful. You've got to pull different parts of it together, which requires a little bit of planning. It takes a little bit more Outlook calendar management, in my view, so that you actually reach out to all the people and bring them onto the team. I argue it's harder now because it doesn't happen organically.
Well, it's interesting too, like diversity and inclusion, I think gosh, it's been upended this year, and it's not news stories, obviously, with what happened with George Floyd in Minneapolis and looking at the racism that's in this country. That's certainly one aspect and a very important aspect of it. But D&I, inclusion and diversity, sometimes that also now means things like the definition has broadened. It could be, the parent with young kids versus the single worker or employee who can work 24/7 around the clock. I mean, those are two different types of employees and their settings. Like, you really have to think about it differently, right, in terms of your teams.
You do. And the first thing you have to understand is that the United States of America is going to be competitive. We can't leave anybody on the bench. We don't have enough numbers and enough well-educated talent to leave anybody uneducated or anybody unused when we compete in the world marketplace. And then the idea of diversity, sometimes we confuse it with equality. We say diversity is a right. No, equality is a right. Diversity is right because it makes you more competitive. It makes you more effective. So diversity should be something that people lever, just like any of the other advantages that an organization can do to make sure all of its talent gets into the room. And that's just common sense.
So, you said about making sure that people, that if you were, at the office and you're in a meeting and you'd have a meeting before, a meeting in the conference room, and a meeting afterwards. And by that way, maybe you incorporate more people. So what do you have to do as leaders to make sure that you're reaching out to those workers that might be at home, where their home situation is maybe a little bit more full than some of your other workers?
Yeah, I mean, you think somebody at my age, I've got a house, I've got a home office, and I can do things, and it's fairly simple, except when my granddaughters run in and stick lollipops to my legs. But what if I'm a young person and I'm not that sure of my position in the organization, and I'm working at the kitchen table, and my spouse has lost their job, and my kids aren't in school because it's closed, and suddenly it's not that easy. And so I'm trying to communicate, but I'm worried about a lot of things. And I also don't have the same network when I'm younger that people do older. And so I don't have a peer to watch to learn my job. I can't look 2 cubicles over and see how somebody else handles something and then learn how to do it. I can't be sure my boss thinks I'm doing a good job because I can't see him smile at me or give me a wink or a thumbs up. And it's uncomfortable for me to call my boss and go, how am I doing? So we as superiors have got to replace that. We've got to figure out first at the peer level how to get people networking so that they get the kind of support they need. But also from superiors at every level, not just the top, we've got to reach out and have conversations, not broadcasts, not motivational, Big Brother broadcasts, but something that says, how are you doing? Because remember in the office, you could always look at an employee and you sense how they're doing by their body language and what's in their eyes. It's harder virtually. And so you've got to pull it out a little bit. And this is what I talk about intentionality. It takes more effort.
Well, so how would you advise companies to do this kind of inclusivity work at scale? I mean, are you seeing any kind of policy innovation from companies that institutionalize the things that you're talking about right here?
Carol, I think everybody's exploring with it. I'm seeing, virtual happy hours. I'm seeing all hands. I'm seeing all combinations. I think there's a number of things. In our organization, we ask every member of our team, we're only 75, to call 2 other members of the team every day. And not their 2 big buds. Call 2 people they don't know as well, just for a 2-minute conversation video, just to build the connectivity. We also have a call every morning with the entire firm, video, so people can all talk and exchange, but there's still the quiet ones on the edges. And so you've got to reach out constantly.
What do you think are kind of the blind spots for leaders right now, Stan? Is it this about, those workers who maybe you're not meeting with, or what do you see right now? Because you're talking to a lot of your clients, and I'm curious what they're telling you or what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think the blind spots are what they don't see, because we don't know how well the team's performing. Your first response is, of course we do. Our stock price is higher, or our revenue's good, or some other KPI is solid. But we actually don't know who's doing the work. The work is getting done, but when you go around the floor, you're not sure who's working hard or who's working effectively or who's suffering, which makes it really hard to tune your organization, to motivate the people who need it, to adjust it. And I sense that leaders in organizations don't really know how their organizations work anymore. I mean, that's funny that I would say that, but for years now, we've been working with companies, and we find they have an org chart. We go in and we do this analysis, and we say, your organization doesn't function like you think it does, not like this. And they look at it and they go, that's right. Nowadays, it functions differently again, and they're not quite sure. There are certain things that seem to be doing well, but it's never functioned in this way before. So when they were younger, they never experienced it, so they can't draw on that kind of a background. So I think that organizations are sort of holding on, and I don't want to be real negative here, sort of holding on thinking, wow, I hope it's running okay, but I'm not entirely sure.
That's a really good point. I want to go back to, I know we've talked about already working from home. Do you think ultimately we're going to look back at this at 5 years and say this was a big change in terms of how workers were able to work? And I think about Silicon Valley saying, all right, you guys want to work, from now on for the rest of your career here, you want to work from home? That's fine. You can live anywhere you want in the country. Are we going to look back, or again, do you think it's still too early to tell?
Yeah, I think it's too early. Stan McChrystal's opinion, and maybe I'm an old guy, no. One, I think people want to be with other people. They work in certain firms because they want the relationships. My years in the military weren't about what we did. It was about being part of that team. It was being shoulder to shoulder with people you trusted. I wanted to get up in the morning and put my grown-up clothes on and go to work and do that, and then come home at night, put on other clothes and be with my wife and son. I think most people want that, and I think it's very good for our psyche to do different things, use different parts of our brain. So I think that the desire to be together is very important. Now, there's a tension there because some people want to live anywhere in the country they want to live, and they want to be long distance from their firm. But my sense is it's much harder being long distance from your firm to be a full contributor. You can be a contributor, but to contribute in quite the same way, because you're just not in all the conversations that occur. You're just not in all the interactions that happen. Some of the informal things that people add to firms when they're just in the hallway. Every firm's got several people probably who people go, well, they don't seem that good at their job, but we love having them on the team because we're better when they're around. And I think that part of the human part is very, very important. Now, again, I think we will leverage technology more to do things faster and better. But I think the essential draw of wanting to be part of a team, wanting to feel like you are shoulder to shoulder with people that you admire is very, very important.
Well, it's interesting, something you said at last year's breakaway. You said video conferencing is far more effective than a phone call, which is far more effective than an email. So, I mean, at least in this environment, all those Zoom, conferences that we're doing or whatever platforms, they're okay. It's better than just a phone call or an email, for sure.
Yeah, there's a hierarchy. There is face-to-face, and then video, and then way down is phone calls. And then way below that are chats and things like that, in my opinion. Because so much of it, and I know me personally, I react a lot to the other person's reaction to me, what their demeanor's like, their facial expressions, and things like that. I'm much more comfortable that way. So I think video is the next best thing, and the better we can make video, higher and higher quality, will be very, very important as well. But I think it's got to be part of it. Think of the relationships that you are most effective virtually with. Those are people typically that you've had a personal relationship as well. Then you get on and you're just sort of renewing them, and you know them 360 degrees. And so when you see them just two-dimensionally, it's not that uncomfortable. When you don't, it's just harder. And so I would argue we're going to get better at using virtual. We are learning it, but it's not going to go all the way, in my opinion.
So when it comes to team building, because I know this is kind of the focus of our conversation, that you would encourage your leaders to encourage their teams to do even more of it, right? Especially in this environment, I would assume.
I would urge do a lot of it, particularly now, and of course, as much as you can. Do team building that you can virtually, and there's some different techniques, not just virtual happy hours, but there are also interactive exercises you can do. Those things are very, very valuable because you're trying to build up the sinew that gets you through all the tough times. You know, if you look at an organization that really struggles in crisis, it's because in the times of non-crisis, they just haven't built up the trust or the interaction or the habits that they need. And so those that have been through a lot, it's not hard. So I think you have to very carefully and deliberately try to build those.
Stan, what needs to be the messaging from a leader right now about diversity and inclusion? Because I do think, as we talked about earlier, you know, everybody has different home situations right now, especially if you're working from home, and some are easier than others. and some are struggling, some are thriving. But I do wonder as a leader, because I've been having conversations with CEOs and others, or even employees at companies where they're like, okay, I hear from my manager, don't worry, do what you need to do. And then something comes out in written form as an email from the company that says, we'd really love to have you back. So again, going back to that mixed messaging, what do we need to do as leaders to make sure that our teams feel confident so that they can be ultimately productive for us?
Yeah, diversity inclusion is getting diversity of thought and talent and capability. And now typically that means a broad range of demographics, sex and race and different things and experience. But ultimately what you're trying to do is get different skills and perspectives and experiences into the room so that you make a holistic decision much better. The thing to remember about diversity is at some point in your life, diversity is going to be threatening to you. And you say, now, wait a minute, if I'm a minority or something that hasn't gotten a fair shake in the past, that's right. But someday you're going to get old and you're going to be the old person. And when people want to bring young people in, you're going to go, wow, you're diversifying at my expense. So the reality is diversity will always be a bit uncomfortable. And so the fact that we have got to create it has got to be something we have to talk about. I spent much of my life in a career where homogeneous was what we sought. We wanted every soldier to look the same so we gave them the same uniform, same haircut, and that sort of thing. But then when we got into really difficult combat, we said that was not right for the counterterrorist fight. We had to get a diverse set of capabilities together, and that was very uncomfortable and unsettling for us. That's going to be true in every organization. And so we need to put it on the table and talk about it. We need to tell people, yeah, we're going to have to do some affirmative action, regardless of what that means in your particular organization. We are going to push some people with less experience, less qualifications forward, because that's the only way to get the first jump to move some of this forward. And I think that we're making progress in the nation, but we're not making progress fast enough. And so that uncomfortable conversation needs to be, front and center.
Now, one of the things that you have said in the past is you said a commonality among really great leaders is that they're self-disciplined. So I'm thinking about in this environment, and we're worried about our companies and their performance. We're worried about our teams and how they're doing. And we're trying to grow our companies in what can be a very tough environment. What do you think leaders need to be most self-disciplined about? And what do you think their teams need to be kind of self-disciplined about as well?
Yeah. I still believe self-discipline is absolute core of it, because most of us know what a good leader should do. And most of us in our current profession know what a good leader in that profession must do, because we're followers of those leaders. And so we have a sense of them. So I think the first thing is leaders have got to be based on values. They've got to put themselves on a foundation of values that they believe in and that other people can believe in, and they need to stick to it. They can't have what we call a say-do gap. They can't say this and then do something differently. And how many times do we find cases of that? And it, of course, undercuts their credibility as leaders. The second is they have to be honest with people. They need to tell people the truth as they know it, which may mean, I don't know what's going on. I am confused. But they need to be honest. And that runs counter to the idea of the great woman or man leader who's supposed to have all the answers and been everywhere and done everything. So I think leaders have got to be those things, and then they've got to be as consistent as possible. But consistent doesn't mean the same every day. It means consistent with responding to the situation as the situation requires or is appropriate for it. Organizations, when we talk about self-discipline, I think have got to, again, identify what their values are and what their priorities are, how they're going to approach their objectives, and then they've got to stick to it. It is so easy to be in an organization, be rowing really hard, and then find out you're going in a direction completely different from what your values or your stated objectives were. It's because you just got a little off course and everybody's working hard, and then suddenly somebody goes, we're doing something we don't even intend to do. And I think that's hard in a big organization to maintain, and that's part of the leader's role.
Before we go, there's one thing I wanted to kind of end on. It's a last thought, because I think about when we think about our teams at work and keeping your team together, building those teams, it's also meant thinking about certainly because of COVID, their physical well-being, their health, but it's also their mental well-being. And I feel like you are someone who understands this, you know, personally, as well as with the troops that you have overseen, you know, the importance of people being healthy physically, mentally, as leaders and also as your teams. You know, what would you tell leaders about that right now?
I would tell leaders first, if in my experience, when you put privates in a defensive position at night, if you put a private alone in a foxhole and they can't see people to their left and right, they will be terrified. And why wouldn't they be? Whether the enemy is coming or not, in their minds, the enemy is coming along with hobgoblins and things like that. And you say, I've got to empathize the fact if I was 18 years old again and I was out in that hole and I didn't know what was going on, I would be terrified. And so you have to put yourself in this position and set things up with that in mind. Also remember that leaders, we get good at putting a sort of a shield around us. Most leaders I know, their kids all go to Ivy League schools, their marriage is perfect, their life is great. You get their Christmas card and letter every year and you just go, how can they be so great? The whole family wears white. Even the dog is good looking. And that ain't my family. That ain't my life. I've had a couple of periods in my life when, you know, as they say, I was lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. And those were times when externally I was very successful and maybe in a position that other people will envy. When you learn that things hurt, when people get hit, it leaves a mark. When people get disappointed, it hurts. When people get frightened at every part in their career and life, it's still. And if we can sort of break through the person's natural desire to hide that and empathize, and we don't have to nail it and says, I know you're scared, I know you're this, that's not important. Just put yourself on the other side of the table and say, what would that person be feeling right about now? And if you can appreciate that, and you don't always have to sympathize, you don't even have to like the person, but if you can empathize enough to put yourself in that position, it often allows you to have a little bit different view, and I think a little healthier view.
Yeah, it's really understanding your work community at all levels and all the individuals. Stan McChrystal, whenever we talk with you, we always learn something. Thank you so much, and I'm glad you're doing well. Thank you.
You're kind, Carol. Thank you.
That concludes today's program. I'd like to thank General Stanley McChrystal and all of our speakers for making time for us today. And I do want to send a special thanks to our series sponsor, Atlassian. And thanks also to all of you for being with us. We know there's so much you're dealing with, a lot coming at you as well. Keep in mind, though, we've got more for you coming. The next event in the series is on November 12th at 12 p.m. Eastern. At that point, we're going to be taking a close look at how leadership is being redefined in this new era. We hope to see you there. Thanks again for joining us. Stay safe, everyone.